Welcome to this new podcast series titled Talking Book Publishing with Steve and Tara. Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon.
And I'm Steve Redhead.
And welcome to this, our fifth podcast in our series between Steve and I talking about book publishing and how to help colleagues move into book publishing, particularly academic book publishing. And this fifth podcast is exploring the murky world of edited collections. Now, here we go. You've edited books, Steve.
I have, yeah.
With colleagues and with your postgraduate community in the MIPC.
Yeah.
I've edited books with the Popular Culture Collective. I'm about to edit a book with our colleagues in the School of Teacher Education as well.
Which I'm going to be part of.
Which you're going to be part of as well, which is fantastic. So, edited collections are a very specific beast in the publishing world. And I want to, particularly in this podcast, think about the choices that academics make in terms of their time and deciding whether or not they should write a refereed article, a book chapter, or indeed push on for a book. But let's start with us. And as an editor, what sort of challenges exist in creating an edited collection of other people's chapters, Steve?
There are certainly lots of challenges, you're right. Yeah. Also, publishers think this sort of type of publishing goes in and out of style, and you get from, in various times, various eras, publishers just saying, we're not interested in that anymore.
Yeah.
And edited collections sometimes get caught by that.
Yes.
We don't want to do that anymore. We just want to do textbooks, or we just want to do monographs. And I think that's part of the problem. So it doesn't always fit nicely with what publishers want. Sometimes it does. Sometimes they go hell for leather in edited collections. I've done quite a few in my 15 books, and I've always enjoyed doing them. Partly because I felt I was very much part of the project. I was the editor and sometimes the joint editor, but I always contributed chapters, and I'd very much been involved in the ones that you're talking about as long-term director or co-director of projects or of research institutes or whatever. And I felt really proud that we'd collected together the work of a particular moment. And I still look back on some of those, particular book like Rave Off, for example, which actually in the Library of Congress created, a new term, rave culture. And looking back on those projects, I'm really glad we did them at the time, even if they were rushed and very, very fast. The whole point in that accelerated culture was to get something from that research at a time that mattered. And, sometimes with warts and all. But I'm glad we did them. And I've always enjoyed working in that sort of area. Edited collections are a great idea.
That they are. And if I can also, we've tried to sort of talk through this podcast series a lot about digitisation as well. And if I can use some examples from both Elsevier and Springer, and I'm sure there are other publishers around the world, they love their edited collections, and I'll tell you why. Because what they do digitally is, of course, you have your edited collection, which can become a book, a paper-based book with cardboard covers, but obviously there is also then the e-book. But further, what the publishers then do is I won't use the word cannibalise, but I will use the word slice. And they slice the book up into each individual chapter, and they allow individual purchasers, buyers, to put their own book together. So in fact, you can take 15 chapters from 15 different books and make it into your own, or indeed buy the individual chapter. So Springer and Elsevier, and I'm sure many others, adore the edited collection because they can almost double dip. They sell it as a paper book, they sell it as an e-book, or as individual chapters, or as new formations.
Yeah, I agree. That's becoming really important. Even, perhaps the last 2 or 3 years we're talking about.
Yeah, and this is a very exciting time to be involved in edited collections. But if I can go through some of the other challenges as well, you've presented a very optimistic picture. I may be much more bent, twisted, and negative at times. I love it too, and I get great, and I'll use the word satisfaction out of helping emerging scholars get their first publication, helping scholars really move the way through their career, try something new and be their editor and really teach them how to write for diverse audiences. I do get a great sense of satisfaction out of that. The challenge is also, though, that there's hours upon hours upon hours upon hours of literally editing the text. So I think the notion that the editor's job is an easy one, I think is nonsense. I think the books I've edited have often taken much, much longer than the books I've written.
Yeah, I agree. Time consuming like crazy.
Yeah, and you're trying to do the best for scholars. The trouble with edited collections is you've got to get everything even. You've got to get everything to a uniform standard, and that's quite difficult if you've got an experienced scholar, like a Steve, say, but you've also, say, got a very young first-year PhD student that's working in a really innovative area that you want an audience to be found for it. But my goodness me, there's some challenges in terms of heightening their scholarship. You once gave me a great piece of advice as an editor where you said, in some ways, you've got to treat the words of other scholars as your own, because your name's on it, so you can't let through just sort of some idiosyncratic language or something that you would see as bad science or bad scholarship. Your name's over it, so it's your responsibility to get it right, and I think that's the great challenge.
I think so. Also, I think it's quite interesting where these kind of collections come from. Certainly when I was an International Research Centre director at the Unit for Law and Popular Culture and Manchester Institute for Popular Culture in Manchester, one of the things we did was we took from the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham, which is no longer, the idea of working papers. And we had a working paper series which was very much a homage to their working paper series. And we then published the eventual edited collections based on those working paper series. So we tried them out first.
Excellent.
And also I find, I have edited a lot of collections and I've been pleased to be involved in them, but I've also written a lot of chapters in books, in other edited collections.
Whereas I haven't. That's
I've been so pleased, particularly later in my career, that younger, really innovative scholars have got in touch with me and said, look, have you got a chapter which would fit this project? And you weren't necessarily involved in the project in the first place, but, have you got something current which would fit? And I have very often in the last few years been really pleased to be involved in those projects. And the thing is that one of the other trends now is that big publishers, say a Routledge, have now got this idea of having handbooks, 60 chapters of 5,000 words on, say, physical cultural studies or sport and new media or whatever. And they have now transformed that market in many ways. They're being sold to libraries very often, but scholars as well. And that has helped to create a bigger market for people actually wanting to write chapters in particular books. And that's quite interesting. That's really taken off. Publishers like Ashgate, Routledge have published a lot of this sort of stuff, and again, only in the last 2 or 3 years. So you get a chance to write a 5,000-word essay in quite a big project.
Yeah, that also puts your marker in the sand too, that you're part of that project.
It does.
So I think that's great. Let's move, therefore, to the strengths of edited collections. I think you've captured a few already. They can be incredibly timely. So one scholar would take a fair amount of time to produce a scholarly monograph, a book.
Exactly.
So if something like Rave, a sporting event, an historical event, something, a theoretical, transcendent hub, something big occurs, someone dies, some anniversary for something. So where you need a lot of scholars to work quickly to get something together to acknowledge that historic moment, I think that's a great strength of an edited collection.
Yeah, I agree.
Another strength, for example, Steve, could be a diversity of voices coming through on a particular project. So instead of a scholarly monograph, that you've actually got multiple views in one book. So that's great for readers. Yes. That's a great strength.
Yes,
as well.
And also multiple forms. You can have edited collections which have chapters or essays, but you can also say have interviews with people within those collections. And I think that's quite an interesting aspect of it.
Yes, I've done that a lot actually. I've, in all the edited collections, a lot of my work with Chandos, for example, but I'm thinking the recent book I wrote on city imaging had Pharisee, Grouse's, remember, Pharisee's poem in the middle of it.
Brilliant.
So the diversity of voices, you can have photo essays, you can have all sorts of disciplines and modes of writing within them.
Yeah.
And I think that makes it much more buzzy and interesting for readers as well.
Yeah, I think that is definitely a strength.
Yeah, and I think the other advantage is you can capture a moment in time, capture a diversity of audiences and a diversity of views. But can we also talk about some of the weaknesses as well? What are the other challenges in edited collections?
I think the danger is that they become unbalanced.
Oh, yes.
And you feel perhaps pressurised to include, if you're an editor, to include work that may not have got into, say, a referee journal collection or something. I think they can become, really quite unbalanced. And as an editor, you have to be really careful there.
And I agree with you. And that's what I was saying earlier on about the evenness. I've always been very conscious of when you're editing, you do your first sweep of edit, your second sweep, your third sweep, and really your remaining sweeps are what are the weakest chapters and lifting those to level.
Yeah.
And I think that takes a huge amount of time. The weakness is also the issue I suppose I want to address for scholars, and this is leading into our last question as well, and it is a weakness of edited collections. What do you think contributors should think about when they're considering whether or not to contribute to a book? If I ask that question in another way, if a scholar like all of us has finite time, should you write a refereed article or should you write a book chapter? Where are we now?
I think that's really difficult. I suppose if you're a head of school telling a younger early career researcher which they should choose, you'd probably go for refereed journal.
I would, as a head of school, I would.
I think, yeah, and I've been head of school recently, and I've actually done that. But I've also encouraged people to kind of think outside the box as well, and maybe even a different version of that refereed article could fit a particular handbook project, say.
Yeah. So I think the handbook project matters a lot because, again, if you've got an opportunity to be at the foundational level of a new paradigm and be in one of those
Go
books,
for it.
I think that is the most important.
It is.
So if you're in that physical cultural studies reader, thanks for playing, ladies and gentlemen.
Yep.
That's probably more important than anything and could be the stepping stone for the next stage.
Really important.
Or in a ZZEC reader or whatever to be really there. So
absolutely.
I think that matters a great deal. I think if you're an early career researcher and you've got someone who is a really experienced editor and you can learn from them and they're prepared to actually edit for you and show you what a book chapter looks like and how you go through the process, I think there's a lot of value add there.
Yeah.
I think you have to pick your editors well. Yeah. If it's just simply submit something and it becomes some sort of homogenised North American nonsense, then I think give it a pretty wide berth and forge your own path. But if you're learning something through the process, then I think that's a great idea to be in that sort of book as well.
Yeah, I agree.
Also, final point too, in terms of interdisciplinarity, if you're in an area that is emerging, I'm thinking sort of city imaging, physical, cultural studies, these sort of multi-approaches, then you'd gain a lot, I think, from being in one of those books that a huge diversity of audiences would read that would never have come across.
Yeah, the audience is transformed.
Yeah, so if you're working in cultural studies, say, and you're in a series which has geography in it as well, then geographers will read your work that you'd never have an opportunity to access. Yeah. So those audiences matter.
Yeah, they do.
Wow, big important one, that one, Steve. Are you ready for our last one?
Ready.
Let's go do it. Thank you for listening to this podcast series on Talking Book Publishing with Steve and Tara. For further information, please feel free to contact us at Charles Sturt University.